Hello, I'm Grin and welcome to Grin Reviews. As you may or may not know, my love for Star Wars knows no bounds. But considering how much Star Wars we did last month, it might be good to do something a little bit different as a bit of a palate cleanser. And perhaps nothing is more different to Star Wars than basketball for the Atari 2600.
Now, I know a lot of you younger viewers at this point are probably wondering, what is basketball? Well, basketball is a fictional game that was invented in 1996 for the movie Space Jam. It involves two teams competing against each other to score points by getting balls through hoops. And at this point, I would not be surprised if you're drawing a similarity between basketball and another certain fictional sport here, because basketball was in fact basically the 90s equivalent of Quidditch. That is, of course, unless you can read, in which case Quidditch would be the 90s equivalent of Quidditch. As you can see on the screen right now, basketball is a fairly complex game with many players and multiple moving parts, so you're probably wondering how they could possibly adapt this to an Atari 2600 game. Well, quite simply, instead they opted to adapt a slightly more simple version of basketball for the Atari 2600. This less taxing version of basketball is known as one-on-one basketball, which is named after the gentleman who discovered it. Not unlike the noble duels fought between badass gunslingers in the Wild West, this version of the game pits you against your opponent and no one else. This means that if you lose the game, you can't blame anyone but yourself because you are the only one playing. And you will almost certainly lose this game a lot because your opponent is fantastically good. He's so good, in fact, that basketball on the Atari 2600 is probably one of the hardest games I've ever played. Even if you set his setting to low and your setting to high, which makes him move slowly and you move fast, it's still almost impossible to win the game. On top of that, not to sound like a conspiracy theorist or anything, but I feel like the Atari wants the AI player to win. Some of the shots that you take that should go through the hoop and score you a point instead just pass straight through it, giving you nothing but a sense of bitter regret. And on top of that, some of the shots that the AI takes shouldn't count at all, but most certainly do. Adding to the frustration, the AI has no trouble taking the ball from you, which is an almost impossible task when you're trying to perform it yourself. All of this said and done, however, the game is not without its good points. For instance, when you sink a hole that is just perfectly done, goes straight through and doesn't impact on the side at all. It just feels, sort of like...
Well, that didn't last long, did it?
At this point, it's probably a good time to talk about the graphics, because the graphics are one of the major issues with the game, but also one of the best things about the game. You see, the issue with the graphics is, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes shots that should not count do count, and ones that should do not. This is largely because the game has some serious depth perception issues. You can control your character moving him up, down, left, and right on the screen, and that's all well and good. But the issue is that this is not a 2D environment, but actually appears to be a 3-dimensional one. This is a problem because you can't really control your character in 3 dimensions despite the game interpreting him as being such. This means that sometimes you aim a shot towards the hoop and it goes through the hoop, and it looks like from your view that it should score a point, but in the 3-dimensional plane that is the game, it's actually passing behind the hoop. This would be all well and good, but your character does not get smaller when he's further in the distance or closer when he's closer to the screen, and on top of that, the ball doesn't change size either, so it's virtually impossible to judge where your character virtually is. The game itself also has trouble with these depth perception issues, as if you catch the ball and walk past your own goal, so your character moves through the hoop, even though it's technically in your character's hands, and so should actually be in the distance and not past the hoop. It's very frustrating that the game has this double standard where it counts your shots as not going through the hoop because it passes behind the hoop, when contrary to that, a ball that is in your character's hand and should not be anywhere near the hoop 3-dimensionally also passes through the hoop when you go past it yourself. The 3-dimensional layout for this game is extremely ambitious, and perhaps a little bit too ambitious for what they could achieve. This would not be an issue if it was a game like hockey or soccer where the ball stays on the ground more, but being basketball, the location of the ball in the 3-dimensional plane is a lot more important, and taking shots is kind of a major part of basketball, so they perhaps should have stuck to a 2-dimensional plane in this game and sort of simplified it a little bit more than they did. That all said and done, the depth perception issues, while being annoying, are not exactly game-breaking, and you do get used to them. You just accept it as part of the game that sometimes the depth perception will be off, and you can continue playing it. Once again, I must refer back to Planet Patrol, where there's glitches in the game that make the game unplayable, and so the game pretty much worthless. But in basketball, you can continue to play the game and still have fun. It's just a little annoying when it happens. And aside from those issues, the art in the game is actually rather fantastic. And you can clearly tell that you're playing as a handsome human being, and your opponent is Kermit the Frog. And I've always wanted to play basketball against Kermit the Frog, so that's another bit of wish fulfillment. Overall, basketball for the Atari 2600 is a challenging and addictive game, and it's really good if you want to go head-to-head with someone. So if you're looking to take a short break from all the space games, then head down to your local video store and pick up a copy of Basketball for the Atari 2600.